The Las Vegas Raiders starting defensive tackle Adam Butler is currently a free agent, and earlier today he was on a podcast, and on that podcast he actually put it out there that he actually wants to come back to the Las Vegas Raiders. And I want to talk about some of what was said, and I also want to show you guys some of the defensive tackles that are coming out of this draft. Even if the Las Vegas Raiders do keep Adam Butler, which I think would be a great move, you still got to go out there and get a defensive tackle. And I want to kind of talk about some of these guys. We'll talk about them a little bit later on. But let's talk about Adam Butler. So Adam Butler sat down with Hondo Carpenter, and he had some interesting things to say, right? He said that it really would be a dream come true. I love this team. I love the organization. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else, right? He basically put it out there that he wants to come back to the Las Vegas Raiders. And when you think about a guy like Adam Butler and the fact that he actually wants to come back to the Raiders, if you're the Las Vegas Raiders front office, you have to make this happen, right? When you think about a guy like Adam Butler, you think about what this guy has shown us over the past couple of seasons as he's been with the Raiders. This guy has not only gotten better and better and better with the Raiders, but just generally speaking over the course of his career, he's gotten a lot better. And this past season, he was a top 12 run defender in the NFL, at least statistically. You know, he might not be that true nose tackle that's going to hold the double team blocks. He's probably not a guy that's going to two gap and those type of things. But statistically, the guy made plays against the run this year. He ranked in the top 12. I think he was actually 12th best in the NFL, to be 100% exact. According to Pro Football Focus's run stops stats, he also ranked top 15 in sacks and quarterback hits for a defensive tackle. So Adam Butler has been really, really solid, and he wants to come back to the Raiders. John Spytek has to bring back Adam Butler. You know, one of the things that I think with the Las Vegas Raiders that we didn't really get to see this past season was the defensive line come together. You know, we knew we had Maxx, we had Christian, we had Malcolm Koonce, of course, and we had Adam Butler, who had a really good year even the year prior. Coming into last year, we said this defensive line could be absolutely incredible, right? You have arguably, you know, if Adam Butler's your worst starting defensive lineman, you have a solid defensive line, right? And of course, we had Maxx. So one of the things we did not get to see was that defensive line actually come together. And my hope is the Raiders can actually go into this next season with the same guys that we could have potentially had last season. Obviously, Butler has to be retained. He's currently a pending free agent, so the Raiders would have to actually be able to bring him back. We're also, you know, not 100% sure if Malcolm Koonce is going to be back. Butler, I think, would obviously be a lot cheaper than Malcolm Koonce. Butler is 30 years old right now. And more than just being 30 years old, this guy is one of those guys that's experienced. He's one of those guys that, you know, he's played a lot of football over the past couple of years, but he's only like 7-8 years in the NFL, right? It's not like this guy's been like 10 years, and yes, he's 30, but he's not truly 30. The way you would see with certain guys, you know, maybe they come in at 20, 21 years old. Butler came into the NFL later, right? He spent more time in college, and he was kind of a late developer as well. He didn't play as many snaps early on in his career. But Adam Butler is one of those guys that's an elite pass rusher. He's one of those guys that can beat any guy in a true one-on-one situation. And the thing with Butler that we got to realize is, you know, if you're an offensive line like the Los Angeles Chargers, right, and you're going to say we're going to utilize a 7-man pass protection, we're going to have a tight end chip, we're going to have a running back chip, and we're going to slide towards Christian Wilkins, right? So essentially the tight end's going to chip on maxx Crosby. You'll have the running back chip on the opposite side, which would then be Malcolm Koonce theoretically. And then you're going to slide towards Christian Wilkins. What that means is you're now going to have a one-on-one with Adam Butler, and Adam Butler can beat most interior offensive linemen one-on-one. In fact, if you guys go back and watch Butler against guys like Joe Thuney, even guys like Trey Smith, Butler has had a lot of success against those guys. Butler's one of those guys that's very, very hard to block because he's so quick, he's so fast, he's so explosive. He moves really well for a defensive tackle. And I think if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, you really have to bring this guy back. You know, another thing to know is not a lot of guys actually, you know, as they come to the Raiders, say that, hey, I want to stay with this team, right? Not every single guy, I should say. Not necessarily a lot of guys, but not every player comes to the Raiders and says, I want to stay with the Raiders, right? We've seen free agents come here, spend a year or two here, and then end up leaving. We've had guys we drafted, right? Josh Jacobs did not want to come back to the Las Vegas Raiders, right? Even though the Raiders apparently gave him the same exact offer as what he got with the Packers, he decided to leave, right? So not every guy wants to actually stay with the Raiders, and Adam Butler does. And, you know, I've personally spoken to Adam Butler multiple times via social media, right? I go back and forth with him via direct messages. And he's definitely a high character player. He's definitely a guy that wants to be here with the Raiders. And he definitely cares about being great, right? He's not one of those guys that's just collecting a paycheck. I think it was, I believe it was Cam Newton that actually put it out there that not every single player actually cares about being great. A lot of these guys just care about that paycheck. That's 100% a fact. And Adam Butler's not one of those guys, right? So hopefully the Raiders bring him back. I think it'd be a very solid piece to be able to kind of keep. But I do want to show you guys some of the defensive tackles that are coming out in the 2025 NFL draft. We'll go ahead and use the NFL mock draft database, who is going to rank the defensive tackles coming out based off of the mock drafts, right? So this is based off of, taking some sort of combination of Mel Kiper and Jordan Reed and Matt Miller, and all the other draft analysts out there that are putting these drafts out there. This is basically a ranking. Keep in mind, this is not accurate, right? I think one of the things that happens is Mel Kiper puts the ranking out there. He says Mason Graham's the top 3 pick, and then everybody starts kind of repeating that, right? So it's not really accurate. I think the mock draft has shown us in the past that it's not 100% accurate, but it still does give us a general list. And I kind of want to talk about some of these guys. And then of course, there's one other thing we'll talk about here in a second, but let's get into some of these guys. If you're the Las Vegas Raiders, you have the 6th overall pick in each round, right? So you have the 6th overall pick in the first round, and you got to figure out who's that player that you need, right? Is Malcolm Koonce coming back? If he's not, maybe you target a defensive end. Is it Matthew Stafford or Aaron Rodgers or Justin Fields or Russell Wilson? And if it's not, maybe it's Shedeur Sanders that you got to go out and target with that 6th pick. But let's say you get a quarterback. Let's say you get a defensive end. Let's say you can just kind of go with the defensive tackle at pick 6, or maybe you take a quarterback and you wait until the 2nd round. There's options. Some people think this is one of the best defensive tackle classes in a really, really long time. Mason Graham is probably the only guy that, if you're the Raiders, you have to probably take with that 6th overall pick. I shouldn't say that. I think there's some other guys that are going to end up going in the 1st round, but I don't think any other guys actually worth that 6th overall pick, right? If you're going to take a defensive tackle. And truth be told, I don't even think Mason Graham's worth the 6th overall pick, right? You guys know how I feel about him if you guys have followed this channel long enough. I'm not as high on Mason Graham as I think some other people are. People are saying this is like a top 3 pick. He's, the greatest defensive lineman coming out of this class. I don't know if I agree with that, right? When I look at defensive tackles, I look at, as an example, a guy like Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter was a top 3 overall player in that class, right? And you just saw it on tape. The pass rush plan, the moves, the technique was elite. I don't see that with Mason Graham as much. Plus, Mason Graham is on the stronger side, right? He's very strong. He's powerful. He has really, really good. He has really good punch. That doesn't translate as well to the NFL because everybody's strong in the NFL, right? But Mason Graham's a guy that the Raiders might actually consider. Again, I'm not that high on him, and I wouldn't be surprised if he falls outside the top 10. There are some guys that I will target in the 2nd round, right? Especially, and keep in mind, even if the Raiders keep Adam Butler, I'm still targeting some of these guys in that 2nd round. The guy that I really like, by far, is going to be Deone Walker out of Kentucky. I think he's a very good fit for the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders have Christian Wilkins, who's, Christian Wilkins should be playing that 3 technique, right? That is what Christian Wilkins is built for. That's where he'll have the most success, right? And then, what the Raiders need is they need a guy that's the opposite of a 3 tech, right? They need a guy that can play that 1 technique, that can play nose, right? It's a guy that's strong, that's powerful, that's physical. And if you guys don't know the difference, one of the primary differences playing on the inside, right? You can say 1 technique, you can say nose. The big difference is you're going to get double teamed by centers and guards, as opposed to guys like, maybe it's a guard and tackle, maybe it's a tackle or a tight end. Guys that might be a little bit weaker, guys that are a little bit more speed-based, as opposed to centers and guards are mostly stronger. So if you play on the inside, you got to be stronger as a defensive tackle. Plus, there's certain schemes, right? If you get into a base 3-4 and you're playing on the inside, you might have to take on double teams a little bit more. Deone Walker, to me, is a guy, if I'm the Las Vegas Raiders, I would take him 100% of the time if he's there in that 2nd round. He might not actually be. There's a chance Deone Walker goes in the top 20 to 25 picks. But he's a guy that I really, really like because I think he fits well with what the Raiders have. And even if you bring back Adam Butler, Butler is a lot closer to Christian Wilkins, and I think Deone Walker is the opposite of those guys. In fact, John Jenkins is also a free agent this year, and John Jenkins really wasn't that good this past season. So I think the Raiders got to go out there and get a large defensive lineman that can play that position. I think Deion Walker would be a really, really, really solid fit. Keep in mind, there's some other guys as well that are coming out this year that are pretty big. Alfred Collins is another defensive lineman out of Texas. Island Collins, another guy that could be a riser as we kind of continue to go through the process. The guy had a really, really good, I think it was the Senior Bowl was where it was at. It might have been the Shrine, but I think it was the Senior Bowl. Really solid there as well, right? There's a couple other guys that I really like out of this draft, especially at that interior defensive tackle spot. Cam Jackson out of Florida is another guy that I'm probably a lot higher than the general consensus. This guy's like 6'4", 6'5", 345 pounds. But he's fast and he has good pass rush technique, right? And I think for the Raiders, you look at this draft class that's coming up, you got to be able to get some defensive linemen on the inside, right? Our interior defensive line is not as deep as the guys on the outside. And I think for the Raiders to have success, to build that, Philadelphia Eagles front that those guys have, right? That elite front, you got to have some good rotational players as well, guys that can win. And a guy like Cam Jackson is probably going to go somewhere between round 2 and 3. So I think he'd be another guy to potentially target at that point. To me, Jackson's definitely one of those guys that I think will be a lot better and will have a lot more hype as we get closer than where he's at right now. There's no way this guy goes pick 190. I just don't see that being realistic. There's a couple other guys that I really like, but I think because of the fact that they're on the smaller side, they're probably going to be like late day 2, early day 3 guys. So there's 2 guys that I really like. You got the Tennessee defensive tackle, Omar Lott. Very, very, very solid football player, as well as Aeneas Pebbles, another guy that's very solid. Both of those guys are like 6 feet tall. So both of those guys, unfortunately, have had their draft stock fall a little bit because of the fact that they're not that big, right? And we generally just don't see defensive tackles that size that are pass rushers specifically have success. We've seen guys like Poona Ford, who I think is like 5'10", 5'11", have success. But Ford is a nose tackle, right? He's one of those guys that's going to stay low. He's going to defend the run. Poona Ford's different because he's a run defender. These guys are pass rushers. And we haven't seen guys that are like 6 feet have that type of success as pass rushers. Now, I will say this, though. Pebbles had some of the best tape I saw from the Senior Bowl. He had so many winning reps against so many people, but he did struggle to defend the run. So it'll be interesting if Pebbles, where he kind of ends up getting drafted. If the Raiders get him in round 4, I think it'd be a solid pick, and I would definitely consider bringing him in at that point. There's a couple other guys I want to talk about that are at the top of this list. Walter Nolan's another guy that's been getting a lot of hype. I think he's a good football player. Would I take him with the 6th overall pick? I would not. Would I trade down to pick, let's say 22, right, which is exactly where he's being ranked, and then would I draft him, and would I be happy about that? I would not. Right? Although I think Walter Nolan can be a good football player, I just don't see him coming in and having the type of impact that the Raiders need from that defensive tackle position. And the thing with defensive tackles is it's very, very easy to predict. Right? You can watch Jalen Carter and you can say this guy's going to be a superstar. You can watch Kalijah Kancey, Christian Barmore, Devontae Wyatt, and say these guys are going to be elite pass rushers. And all 3 of those guys are elite pass rushers, right? Obviously, Christian Barmore hasn't really been healthy. Devontae Wyatt hasn't been healthy either. Which is a different aspect, right? We can't really predict those things. But there are guys that are elite pass rushers that you can kind of predict. And another guy that I would 100% target from the Raiders is going to be Oregon defensive tackle Derek Harmon. The guy transferred to Oregon, I believe it was just this past season. So he played 1 year at Oregon. Before that, I don't know exactly where he came from. But the guy was solid. Very, very, very solid. Has good pass rush technique. He's strong. He's a guy that I think is probably a little bit more similar to Christian Wilkins than as opposed to a guy that's like the opposite, right? He's like a 1-tech. But you know what? If you're playing a 4-man front, it doesn't matter as much. Obviously, Christian Wilkins will have to come to the inside a little bit more if you go after a guy like Derek Harmon. But the thing with that and why it could work for the Raiders is because Christian Wilkins, although production-wise it might take a small dip, he's still a really good football player, and I can see him playing that interior spot as well, right? And I think with a guy like Derek Harmon, if you get this guy in the 2nd round, you're adding a very, very talented defensive tackle. And what's crazy about this defensive tackle class is this class is arguably as good as I believe it was the 2019 class where we saw guys like Christian Wilkins, Dexter Lawrence came out, Jeffrey Simmons in that same class, and I believe that was the year Quentin Williams came out as well. That defensive tackle class was absolutely incredible, right? And this class could be just as good, if not better. In fact, we might actually see 7 or 8 guys go in the first round at that defensive tackle spot. Like, I would not be surprised if that actually ends up happening. Another guy that I really like coming out this year is going to be Toledo's Darius Alexander. This guy's definitely flashed a lot, not only at Toledo, but he went to the Senior Bowl and he flashed at the Senior Bowl as well. And I just realized that the Senior Bowl symbol's right there, so you can actually see which guys were at the Senior Bowl and which guys were not. I forget, it was Alfred Collins saying, was he at the Senior Bowl or not? And you can see this symbol right there. So he was definitely the Senior Bowl, not the Shrine. Keep in mind, we have tape to both, and we definitely analyze these guys we analyze both of the games, right? Even the Hula Bowl. There was a guy at the Hula Bowl that I personally really liked. Really, really good dude. I'll go ahead and show you guys where he's at. Junior Tefanu, who was a guy that was at the Hula Bowl. Really, really solid character. He actually ended up having a really good Hula Bowl, and he was actually invited to the Senior Bowl as well. And he had some good reps at the Senior Bowl as well. But Senior Bowl has a lot of really good players, right? So it's one of those things where, you get so many good football players at the Senior Bowl. It's hard to kind of evaluate and take from every single one of these guys, especially with the social media narratives that kind of start up, right? Like Pebbles had a really good Senior Bowl, but I didn't really see him trending at all during that week. And of course, there's a couple other guys that had really good Senior Bowl weeks as well. But again, you don't really see them trend all that much during that process. Cam Jackson's an example of a guy that had a pretty good Senior Bowl. Jordan Phillips, he was at the Shrine. He had a really, really good Shrine. So another guy to kind of keep an eye on. This defensive tackle class is very, very legit, right? And I think as the Raiders kind of get into that process, as they kind of get into, hey, let's add depth. Maybe Adam Butler doesn't come back, so maybe you take 2 defensive tackles. The Raiders got to just put themselves into a position where you're bringing in talented defensive linemen. Dave Ziegler made a huge mistake not drafting Jalen Carter, but he also made a huge mistake drafting the wrong Byron Young. He made a huge mistake drafting Neil Farrell Jr. and a couple other defensive linemen that he drafted, right? It wasn't just Jalen Carter that we drafted that didn't work out. We drafted so many guys under that regime that did not work out. So John Spytek and whoever else he kind of puts in charge to help the draft process, they got to be able to figure it out and draft some good defense tackles, especially in this class where it's super, super deep. I know we need a quarterback, but you got to get a defensive tackle. I don't care what anybody says. You got to get one. Even if you bring back Adam Butler, and I know you have Christian Wilkins, you just got to continue to improve that defensive line. And, you take a strong suit of your team and you make it even stronger, right? You make it one of the most disruptive units in the NFL. And I think that's going to be the way the Raiders win the Super Bowl. If they win one in the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be to take that defensive line and take it to the next step. There's also some other news that kind of came out. Tom Pelissero just put this out about an hour ago. He put it out there saying that the Las Vegas Raiders and assistant general manager Champ Kelly have mutually agreed to part ways per source. New general manager John Spytek is taking over the front office, and Kelly, the one-time Raiders interim general manager, will pursue opportunities elsewhere. Now, this is interesting because Champ Kelly is technically under contract with the Raiders. And Champ Kelly did not get a job as a general manager somewhere else. This is just straight up John Spytek basically firing Champ Kelly. And I know it's, they mutually agreed to part ways, but realistically, John Spytek is firing him, right? Or he's cutting ties, however you want to say it to be nice or whatever. But Champ Kelly is essentially getting fired. And, it's interesting because Champ Kelly had some general manager interviews. Now, some people will say, hey, those interviews might not actually really mean a whole lot. Maybe he wasn't really in consideration for those positions. But the fact that the Raiders are moving off of Champ Kelly is interesting nonetheless. Now, John Spytek is also going to be one of those general managers, similar to the way he was with the Buccaneers. Remember, John Spytek was not the Buccaneers general manager. But what John Spytek did was he was basically in charge of the draft process, right? And he wasn't the director of college scouting, right? Where he was he was an assistant general manager. So the way the Buccaneers' current general manager did it was he empowered the guys underneath them to make decisions. And John Spytek was empowered to be the guy to kind of do the drafting. And it'll be interesting to see if Spytek takes that same approach. And something tells me he is going to take that same approach. And something tells me the assistant general manager that the Raiders bring in will have a lot of essentially he'll have a lot of power, right? Whoever that guy is that John Spytek does decide to bring in, he'll have a ton of power. And I almost feel like that was probably why Spytek decided to move off of Champ Kelly, because Spytek wanted to be able to bring in his own guy that he was going to kind of empower. And, maybe his mindset is the same way that allowed the Buccaneers current general manager to have all that success. It's going to be interesting to see Spytek as he kind of goes forward, and him just kind of figuring it out, right? Like, do the Raiders draft the quarterback? Do they target a free agent? The Buccaneers obviously went down the free agency route, right? And even before Baker Mayfield, they went with Tom Brady. Before that, they had Jameis Winston. I believe they drafted Jameis Winston in the first round. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that was kind of how that kind of that's how that kind of panned out. What's interesting about that is, they draft the quarterback, but then they target free agent quarterbacks. And it'll be interesting to see if the Raiders take that same approach where they target free agent quarterbacks. Because if that's the approach that you take, that means with that 6th overall pick, you can get better as a football roster. That means with the pick in the 2nd round, you're not taking a quarterback that's developmental. We know most developmental guys don't really work out. Instead, you're getting better, right? You're getting Jackson Powers Johnson type of production or whatever you could get, right? It's going to be interesting, man. And again, we're 3 weeks away from free agency. We're going to start to get cuts kind of coming, right? Like Gardner Minshew might get cut. We might start hearing that the Raiders aren't bringing back Trayvon Merrick, and Trayvon Merrick will test free agency. We're going to start to get a lot of these reports that are kind of coming out. And I'll be the first to tell you guys, when Trayvon Merrick, a guy you draft in the 2nd round, who's a top 10 safety, as he's approaching free agency, or even as the year's kind of going on, you ultimately want to try to bring that guy back and sign him. And it's unfortunate, the Raiders obviously, went from Tom Telesco, they fired him and went to John Spytek. So Spytek didn't have the opportunity during the season to bring back Trayvon Merrick. But as we go forward, I hope the Raiders are able to take care of their own guys during the season, and they don't get to the point where Trayvon Merrick can go test free agency, right? I hope we get to that point where our guys are actually legit players, the Hobbs, the Koonces, the Merricks. I hope those guys can get taken care of during the season, and the Raiders don't have to go out and try to spend all this money to, buy a defensive tackle or buy a center or whatever it is, right? I hope as the Raiders go forward and John Spytek hopefully has success, I hope the Raiders can get to a point where they only pay their own players and hopefully win a Super Bowl, man. That's obviously the goal as we kind of go forward. But Champ Kelly and the Raiders have split up. Adam Butler, hopefully the Raiders are able to bring him back. If not, there's a lot of defensive tackles in this class, man. Let me know what you guys think. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.